Okay, I see folks are starting to join. Hello, everyone. Thank you for hopping on the webinar today. We're actually going to get started in just a minute or two. We had quite a few folks register for the webinar, so we want to give everyone just a little bit of time to trickle in. In the meantime, feel free to share where you're joining from in the chat, maybe how many weeks you have left in the semester, and we'll get started shortly. All right. Okay. So thank you all for joining today's webinar. I see Alabama in the chat, California, Tennessee. Looks like we've got folks from all over. Thank you all for joining. Today's webinar is going to be about generative AI tools. The one we're probably all most familiar with is ChatGPT, but there are many others. And we're going to be talking about how those tools might impact education. I just want to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees have been muted for this webinar. That's just to reduce background noise. We do want to hear from you. So please feel free to share any comments and questions, ideas, thoughts in the chat throughout the webinar. I'm going to also turn on the captions for the webinar. So hopefully those start to pop up and you can see those if you need them. Usually someone comments in the chat if they're visible or not visible. Like I said, we are going to want to hear from you. There will be a Q&A session with our panelists today following lightning talks and a short panel discussion. So at any point in the webinar, just drop a question or a comment into the chat. On the note of panelists, we have a really fantastic panel for today's webinar. I'm going to quickly introduce them before we dive into the lightning talks. We have Liz Losh. Liz is a professor of English and American Studies at William and Mary. She previously directed the Culture, Art, and Technology program at the University of California at San Diego. Liz has authored several titles, including Understanding Rhetoric, which is a Macmillan Learning book. She is currently a co-chair of the 4Cs, the Conference on College Composition and Communication, and MLA Committee on Generative AI and Writing. We'll also get to hear from Stuart Selber, who is a professor of English at Penn State and director of the Penn State Digital English Studio. He is the past president and fellow of the Association of Teachers of Technical Writing, a past president of the Council for Programs in Technical and Scientific Communication, and a past chair of the 4Cs Committee on Technical Communication. Stuart has also authored several books, including Technical Communication and Practical Strategies for Technical Communication. Unfortunately, we won't have Tyler DeWitt with all of us today, but we are very fortunate to have Jonathan Bratt, who is a senior data scientist at Macmillan Learning. I had the pleasure of sitting in on a recent talk that he gave on generative AI, and it was incredibly informative and helpful. Jonathan taught at Huntington University for several years before joining Macmillan in 2013 as a physics content expert, and his role eventually changed to focus on data science and machine learning. But his goal has remained the same, which is to use technology to improve the educational experience for both students and instructors. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jonathan to kick us off.
All right, thank you, Symphony. I'm thrilled to be here. I always love talking about these kinds of topics, and it's exciting that the whole world is talking about it these days. And it's hard to believe. I think even for those of us who have been in the field for a while, it's hard to believe that the impressive and powerful capabilities that we're seeing from these modern large language models, they come from the application of very simple ideas. Because language models are based on a simple idea, and they fundamentally do a very simple task. They predict the next word that a human would use. So given some input context, initial context, they output the probability that the next word is this, that, or the other. And by repeatedly predicting what just the next word is, you can, in theory, build up whole sentences, paragraphs, or even pages. So these models are in some ways just like the predictive text on your phone that tries to predict the next word that you're going to type. But there's an important difference. The predictive text that we've been familiar with on our phone or now email works with pretty small input contexts. And what makes these large language models so powerful is that they can predict appropriate continuations to very large input contexts, which also allows them to produce relatively long coherent outputs with that iterative prediction. So when you think about this, it's easy to make a language model that considers only the last word or two. All you have to do is look at historical patterns of usage. Given a particular word, what words are most likely to follow that word? So if you have very small contexts, you could make a language model, right? But as you look at larger and larger contexts, it becomes more and more unlikely that anybody in the history of the world has ever used that particular combination of words, like ever. So you can't just go and look at history to tell you the answer, what's likely to come next. You have to now calculate the answer by extrapolating from examples that we do have access to. When I say calculate, I mean that literally. These models are fundamentally mathematical functions. The input words get turned into numerical objects, math is done, and then the output gets transformed back into words. So the details, I just glossed over the details. The math that is done matters a lot. And the term transformers that we're all familiar with now, that's the T in GPT. The transformers refers to the mathematical machinery that's running inside that makes this possible. And while transformers are a relatively new technology, they're not brand new. They're not that new. Transformers have been the dominant architecture, the dominant mathematical machinery in natural language processing for about 5 years now. So we've had a while to study these structures, to experiment and explore with them, and to try to understand what makes them so effective at producing mathematical representations of language. And transformers themselves are based on a relatively simple idea. Without going into too much detail now, what transformers do far better than any models before them is to capture relationships between words. So this allows the models to represent not just the static meaning of words in isolation, but now the dynamic meanings of words in a context. And it turns out that this matters quite a lot when you stop to think about it. You'll start to appreciate how much the context of a word affects the meaning of the word. And so it was this innovation, this additional capacity in the language models that really kicked off the golden age of natural language processing, which we're all appreciating now. So that's a very condensed account of how these models work. I like to think of it as relatively simple ideas, but with very profound and powerful results.
Thank you, Jonathan. I really love that you noted that transformers are not new. I feel like there's that gives the feeling of a little bit more safety and security, similar to when COVID vaccines came out, and we all learned that a lot of the science behind the vaccines wasn't that new. It makes it a little bit less scary and intimidating.
Comforting.
Liz, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Yeah, and I would underline this point about how these technologies have been around for a while, even if we're sort of reaching a high media saturation point when it comes to their implementation in various academic and professional settings. I've been writing about text generators since 2007, and my mentor, Ellen Strensky, was writing about text generators in the 1980s. And of course, in the field of electronic literature, they've been looking at text generators that go back to the 1950s and 60s. However, the power of these large language models that use user data is in fact something that's both quantitatively and qualitatively different. So I'm going to really fly by the seat of my pants today, talking about invention and revision by doing a live demo. And so what I'm going to do right now is share my screen, and hopefully I can find the right screen to share. Okay, so you all should be seeing my my screen up. Okay, let's see. Here's my ChatGPT screen right now that you should be that should be visible to you. And so one of the things about this kind of prompt is it's a prompt that encourages students to reflect on invention. So I've basically asked ChatGPT to write a 5,000 word essay about Marx. And one of the things you'll notice is ChatGPT is very literal minded, right? 5,000 words comes along and it stops mid-sentence. So you'd have to add some additional parameters to the prompt for it to stop doing that. And a common kind of assignment that I've seen using ChatGPT, thinking about ChatGPT's capacities for invention, is students are asked to produce an essay using ChatGPT, and then they're asked to critique it, right? So this is supposed to be an assignment that asks students to develop their skills when it comes to critical literacy, to think about the elements of successful college writing that might engage with Marxist theory, for example. Now, I'm going to show an example of something that can be done in real time, and I'm going to using this new chat feature, I'm going to use an actual example that's being used right now to advertise the mobile version of ChatGPT, which is coming from a third-party developer. So the prompt that's being used in this advertisement is write a 2,500 word essay about climate change. So I'm going to go into my ChatGPT prompt box, and I'm going to put in that prompt, and we're going to see what it produces. And you can see the ways that it's actually working word by word. One of the things I would point out about its calculus is that it often doesn't pick the most statistically likely next word, because it in doing a lot of research, they find that these results aren't quite as human sounding or as natural, or they have a tendency to spit out cliches. Okay, now one of the things you'll notice is this has produced more of an outline than an essay. And so I can now ask ChatGPT to revise this content. So revise this essay in a paragraph, in paragraphs rather than outline form. Okay, so now I'm asking it to now go and produce this essay about climate change. And it's going to start by talking about the causes of climate change. And it'll identify both human and natural causes. And then it's now talking about the effects of climate change. Sometimes this setting will be called the consequences of climate change. And then finally, it's producing a section that's called solutions to climate change. And it's often pretty vague in what it spits out, but it has relative complexity when it comes to the sentence level coordination and subordination of argumentative elements. So now I'd like to point out something that's really interesting when it comes to how revision might work, which has to do with something that we talk about a lot in our writing classes, which is style and voice. So now I'm going to ask ChatGPT to revise this essay in the style of an earnest and passionate 20-year-old climate activist. So now I'm asking ChatGPT not only to produce an academic essay, but something that has that feel of the human. And so let's go ahead and see what ChatGPT produces. And again, it produces something different each time. The language model is constantly growing. It's always being tweaked. And you'll notice that this has a much more personal tone. It really emphasizes the concept of personal responsibility as an organizing feature of the discourse. So I think that's something really interesting to observe. Now, for a lot of students who are anxious about writing and just getting started, the possibility of doing something, and I think that Rebecca Moore-Howard's research on patch writing is also instructive here, is that we can think about students who have a lot of anxiety about producing text and say, if you're going to use this assistive technology, you need to really revise the organization that ChatGPT provides to you. And you need to really make sure that all of the material that you turn in is your own language and your own evidence and research, right? But that for many students, they're going to be using this to deal with questions of anxiety when it comes to responding to a given prompt. Now, I'm going to take an example that I think is really interesting, which is, let's take a look now at an example of a piece of writing where this is written by somebody who's a second language, who's an English language learner. So let's go ahead and take a look at this passage. Okay, so this is an example that actually comes from a scoring guide. And I'm going to put this, I'm going to start a new chat. And I'm going to say, correct the grammatical errors in this passage. And all of these prompts are available on a slide deck that, that Symphony has. So here you'll see that it's now going through and it's continuing to use the colloquial language of the original, but it's cleaning up the sentence level errors in mechanics, usage, grammar, and spelling. But for me, what's interesting is to see kind of the additional steps that are possible using something like ChatGPT for revision. So now I'm going to ask it to rewrite this essay in more academic language because it's reproducing that colloquial tone of the original. And now it's going to produce an essay that's using much more academic diction. So again, this is one of the really interesting things about working with ChatGPT is you see that there are a lot of nuances that you can tease out when it comes to variations in tone. And it also can be pretty sophisticated when it comes to genres as well. Okay, so now one more thing to think about for those of you who might be thinking about curricula that includes learning in the modern languages. So now we're going to ask ChatGPT to rewrite this essay in Spanish. And it's got a pretty good database of Spanish as well. And so we could see that for learners who are not only working on composition in English, but composition in language other than English, that its powers of translation are relatively strong. Okay. Let's think about another invention and revision scenario. And let's think about the situations in which ChatGPT might refuse to actually provide content. So now I'm going to ask ChatGPT. Oh, I'm getting this spinning wheel of death for a moment. Okay, I'm going to ask ChatGPT to write a research paper of approximately 5,000 words using social science format. And here you'll notice it says, I'm sorry, that is an AI language model, right? I'm unable to produce research. That's not something I can do. But I can give you the general template that you might want to use for a social science research paper. So this is one of, this is sometimes called prompt hijacking, is how do you get around the fact that there are situations in which ChatGPT will actually refuse to provide results. So for example, if you ask it to provide a job description for a pirate or a diversity statement for the American Nazi Party, right, it will refuse to produce those sorts of documents. However, there are often ways to get around it. One thing that I've also noticed about ChatGPT is it's often averse to reading against the grain or posing a risky hypothesis. So it used to be if you asked ChatGPT to produce work about, say, Lincoln's queerness or the possibility of a queer Abraham Lincoln, it would refuse. But now in the most recent iteration, at least when I tested it a couple of days ago, it is now willing to provide that more kind of reading against the grain, countercultural argumentative work. Okay, so let's look at one more scenario because I know our time is short, but this is an example from a colleague at North Dakota State University that I think is interesting. I'm going to start a new chat here. And this is a way that she gets her students to think about what could be called prompt engineering. So in this case, students write a resignation letter from God, citing X and Y as reasons for leaving his position. Okay, so I'm going to put in pollution and how about religious strife? Okay, and then we'll go ahead and, okay, and so now we get the resignation letter from God, where God explains that he's going to be resigning from this position for these two different reasons. So often providing these kinds of variables like X and Y can be a way to get students to start thinking about this idea of prompt engineering. This same instructor also created a prompt, write an application letter from Satan to be master of the universe, arguing that his skills at A, B, and C would improve human existence. However, one of the things I would point out is that you see definite bias in the training data. In other words, some kinds of writers are better represented in the ChatGPT database than others. So let's say I want to write an essay about violence in video games, citing scholarship from Ian Bogost and Henry Jenkins that uses examples from the game, let's say Grand Theft Auto, which is a game known for creating controversy about violence in video games, although both Ian Bogost and Henry Jenkins argue that violence is not the most important thing to study in video games. Now, both of these writers are frequently cited. Both of these writers write for popular magazines like The Atlantic, or they've written for the New York Times. And so ChatGPT is able to provide, not necessarily, in academic bios are something that ChatGPT really does struggle to produce accurately. But I think you'll see from this kind of response that it does relatively well with this kind of prompt where these academic writers are already public figures. But you'll see other kinds of situations where you might have a writer who's less likely to be cited or less likely to be part of the public sphere. And that won't be the kind of thing that ChatGPT knows much of what to do with. Okay. Now, ChatGPT can do all sorts of things, right? It can write itineraries. You could have it write wills. I mean, it doesn't always do them well, as Stuart will explain in a moment in the example. But, it's interesting to see how people in many workplaces are now using ChatGPT for writing emails. So here's a sample email. We'll start a new chat. And here I'm asking my coworker in an email not to take credit for my work. And so this is my invention prompt. And the writer is a bit sort of prickly in tone here. And so maybe I might want to revise this invented prompt by by revising the email. So rewrite the email, and I'm going to ask it to rewrite this email in a friendly but firm tone. Okay, so I'm going to put that in there as my prompt. And now you'll see that there's a much more kind of warm and fuzzy tone, right? I totally get that we're both passionate about our work and want to, so we have this sort of attempt to find common ground in the response. So the last thing I'd like to talk about, though, is factual hallucination and why assigning things like annotated bibliographies can be particularly illuminating when it comes to ways that ChatGPT doesn't necessarily do such a great job. So here I'm going to ask ChatGPT to write an annotated bibliography about feminism and technology. And since I used to run a feminist collective called FemTechNet, I feel this is something that, I know pretty well what a good annotated bibliography would look like. Oh, and here's something interesting. So I ran the same test yesterday, and a number of the publications were actually incorrect. So that it would be the correct author for somebody, a feminist working in science and technology studies, but it was it was a made up work that was from a made up title that didn't actually exist. Now, what's interesting is that today, when I ran the same test, instead of having a made up text by Judy Weissman, it gives me a real text, which is this book, Technofeminism. Now, and it is actually published by Polity Press. It's actually by the correct publisher. And if I check, it's actually the correct date as well. So this is a case where just yesterday, it was hallucinating titles that didn't actually exist. And today, it's not necessarily producing as many hallucinatory results. And so I think that's another thing that's interesting, is that these technologies are moving really quickly. And this is sort of the point that I will end with, and that the possibility that they will soon be standard parts of, say, composing platforms like Microsoft Word. I think large language models will inevitably be like something like autocomplete, part of many of these sort of day-to-day writing technologies that we use. And so focusing too much on punishing or disciplining students won't necessarily make much impact.
Thank you, Liz. Let's go ahead and hand it over to Stuart, and hopefully you can see the screen with Stuart's slides.
Okay, thanks, Symphony. And I don't know how many people teach technical writing, but my example is going to come from technical writing. And it's going to focus on not the output so much, that you were saying a bit on the output, but more on the input. And what Liz talked about, this kind of new phrase, prompt engineering. My demo is going to look at the marketplace for AI prompts, and it examines what a commercial prompt buys us and fails to buy us for procedural writing, which is taught in many technical communication courses. You've probably heard of prompt engineering. It's a new task and sometimes an entirely new job whose goal is to improve the output users receive from AI robots. An assumption from prompt engineering is that not all prompts are created equal. Some prompts are better than others at generating useful content. Another assumption is that writing prompts require special skill and knowledge of how generative AI works, and so it makes sense to outsource this task to trained professionals. So let's see what we think about the capability of a purchase prompt and about what type of knowledge can contribute to useful prompts for technical communication, which is my example. This applies to really any domain. I purchased the prompt from promptbase.com, a popular site for buying and selling AI prompts. At the time of this writing, 4 prompts were available for ChatGPT. I chose instructions generator because this prompt claims to make it easy to communicate complex topics. Simplifying complexity is a hallmark goal in technical communication, as all teachers know. Okay, here's the prompt. You can see it more easily in the handout that I gave Symphony to share with you. You simply replace the placeholder content between the brackets and then copy and paste the prompt into ChatGPT. Remember, this prompt is for a robot, not a person, and that a prompt engineer designed it and I bought it, presumably to save time and energy. Okay, so to test the prompt, I replaced insert subject with FlowFlex COVID-19 antigen home test. I wanted to try a consequential procedure. Okay, so here are the instructions generated by the robot. You can see the full document in the handout. So if you teach instructions, you see some things on the positive side. For example, the robot decomposes the broad task into logical subtasks, and it uses the imperative mood. These are important techniques that all of us teach routinely. But there are significant problems with both the output, the instructions, and the input, the prompt. Here are some examples. Headings are numbered, which is unconventional for the genre. Steps are bulleted, which is also unconventional for the genre. Users are not told how deeply to insert the nasal swab. It should be 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. So this step lacks specificity. Users don't need to tilt their heads. This is an unnecessary step. Users should rotate the swab for 15 seconds in each nostril, not 10 to 15 seconds. This is inaccurate information. And users are not told to swirl the nasal swab for 30 seconds in the extraction tube. This is a missing step. So either one of the last 2 problems could produce a false result. So it's not a particularly good instruction set. But the output, of course, reflects the input, and there are many problems with the prompt. For example, the prompt does not account for a title, how to and gerund forms are conventional, an overview of the task, a list of items users will need, and signal words, note, caution, warning, danger, and safety measures. The prompt asks for visual aids, but not in a way that works. If prompted effectively, the robot can describe visuals that might be useful. But as you can see, the results included no descriptions for visual aids. And the prompt includes a spelling mistake, costumer instead of customer, defying its own command to proofread carefully. ChatGPT does recognize costumer as a misspelling of customer, but it won't always recognize misspellings. So what's my overall assessment of the procedural writing produced by the robot? In my class, if a student turned in the robot's response as their own, they would receive a failing grade. In short, the instructions do not reflect many, if not most, of the techniques we teach for procedural writing. I would also give the instructions a failing grade from a usability perspective. From this perspective, procedures are successful if users are successful at employing them. But the inaccurate and missing information in the document is likely to lead to a false result. After all, these problems are associated with sample collection and extraction. Of course, AI robots are going to get better and prompts are going to get better. but better prompts will need to be informed by what technical communicators know about genres, literacy, and more. So our involvement will be essential in helping the robot produce instructions that actually work for people. Okay, that's my little demo.
Okay, I'm going to stop the screen sharing, and I want to thank you all for your lightning presentations. I am going to pull up a few questions that we have prepared for today, and use this time to ask these to you. But if any of the attendees have questions, you can start to share those in the chat, and I will be fielding those for our panelists in a few moments. So we have a really great group of faculty advocates at Macmillan Learning, and we recently asked them about their fears and hopes for generative AI. And one person stated the following. She said, "I wish we were paying more attention to why students are willing to outsource their education to AI in the first place. Why don't they see the intrinsic value in education? Why haven't we done a good job of demonstrating it to them?" And that she understands that with the high dollar cost of a college education, she gets that some students might feel that they have to jump through certain hoops just to get the grade. I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts on that, or a response to kind of, those pressures that students may feel, and why they might be so inclined to turn to a tool like ChatGPT in this moment.
And I think that the kinds of anxieties that students feel about continuing to produce the necessary output for the credentialing that they feel is necessary for the job market in somewhat cynical ways, that's been an issue that's been around for a while. And I think that there's this tendency sometimes to demonize the ways that students might marshal technology in order to achieve goals that might not necessarily align with our goals as faculty, and want to kind of police and surveil them as a result. And, I think right now, something like ChatGPT is a rapidly moving target. So I can tell you ways to ChatGPT proof your assignments today, right now, that work pretty well. But those methods might not always work in the future. So that the more important question is that question of motivation, right? How do students feel that writing instruction translates into meaningful work, not necessarily meaningful professional career work, but it could be activist work, it could be artistic work, it could be work that involves their social circles or informal learning communities or lifelong learning communities. But I think that motivation piece, right? Why do you care about learning? And we know writing is an important mode of learning. Why, how do we get students invested in that writing? And that's something I spend a lot of time thinking about when I design a course.
I mean, that's my simple answer, which is, teachers of writing are teaching people to be writers, but for all teachers in all fields, writing is a way of learning. And if someone simply puts a prompt into a box and hands in the content for their own, no learning's happened.
Right.
So, we need to be relevant, and students need to see the relevance of what we do. But I can't convince all of my students, to care about school. I can do my part in that project. But this is a very mixed bag. I think that's clear to people. And you've got a polarized discourse from people who think it's destroying literacy to people who think it's revolutionizing work. And the answers are always in the nuances between those two. It's not going to save anybody time. It's going to shift time. It's not going to save anybody work. It's going to shift work. I watched a guy who put a YouTube video together where ChatGPT created an Excel macro for him. in about 10 minutes that would have taken him the weekend to do. But he didn't then take the weekend off, right? Like he did other work. So, I think we need to be sober about investigating what's possible here. It will be embedded in everything soon enough. And even if assistant isn't quite the right metaphor, we do need to teach students how to write with and against it and be productive. And we ourselves as teachers need to be involved in that decision making. And to me, that kind of thinking makes the most sense.
I really like this question, Symphony. I think it kind of gets to the heart of the challenge here, because speaking from a technical perspective, we have right now at this point in time more tools than ever before for motivated learners. We also have more tools than ever before for those who want to shortcut their own learning process, right? And as I was reflecting on this question, it reminded me of some parenting advice that I read many years ago about getting your kids to eat their vegetables. And the advice, for better or worse, was don't tell the kids, the broccoli is good for you. Focus on how delicious it is. And that has stuck with me over the years. And I think there's some application to this question here. If we're always telling students to treating learning as an adversarial situation where do this thing because it will be good for you down the long run, we're always working against the headwinds here. And this is easy to say, but if we can get students to enjoy the process, then we get them on our side, and then they have access to all these new technical tools that are being developed.
You've all made such fantastic points. Yeah, I think you're all onto something with, being relevant and getting students actually enthusiastic, not just telling them something is good for them.
And it may not end up being good for them. We just don't know.
Right.
We're supposed to, we don't want our heads in the sand as teachers. We want a seat at the table. We want technical people like Jonathan to realize that somebody with domain knowledge about writing needs to be involved in the development of AI tools. So these tools aren't just handed to us and we feel helpless, but rather we're involved in the process of tool development. And we help technical people think about it from the perspective of writing teachers. I mean, often you will hear people interviewed about ChatGPT or other AI platforms. It's a futurist. It's an IT person in a university. They certainly have a useful perspective. But this is a writing platform. Like, where are the trained writing researchers in the process of developing a writing platform? And if you're not going to include trained writing teachers, then you're just leaving a lot on the table. The challenge for us is, as writing teachers, is to step forward so Jonathan understands that we want a seat at the table. We have something to contribute. And I think to me, that's the best approach.
Well, what will be interesting is, as someone who works in marketing, there are tools like ChatGPT that are specifically designed for marketing. It'll be interesting to see if at some point tools specifically designed for students start to emerge, and if writing educators are brought into the builds on those tools. Before getting to the attendee questions, and I see several are popping in, I just want to ask one more question for the panel. And that is one that came out of something that Liz said when we were all preparing for this webinar. Liz, you said that often the things that are the easiest to measure aren't always the most meaningful. And I'm wondering if you all have any thoughts on how the rapid adoption of tools like ChatGPT change how we assess students now and in the future?
Well, I hope that we're not buying into the media panic or whatever other panic is out there. I mean, evaluating students is a big responsibility. And we need to be patient and thoughtful. Can't move the goalposts on them. We need to be fair. We see 19,000 students a year in our 2 gen ed classes. So last thing I want to do is try to keep pace. There's the rapid pace of IT adoption, and then there probably is the too glacial pace of higher ed. But there's a reason why we move slowly. There's a reason the law moves slowly, often too slowly. But there's a reason that we do that. So, you know, I don't want to make any decisions in 3 months that aren't mature, thoughtful decisions informed by research about assessment and evaluation. And so I think we're at a stage where that's what we should be exploring, rather than running around and rewriting entire curricula. I just think doesn't make much sense.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we do as writing teachers is we get our students exploring interesting questions about identity construction. And often identity construction involves technology and all different kinds of technologies, including social media postings and games and all kinds of things, in addition to, you know, assistive AI writing technologies. And we also try to develop their literacy. And I think that as these technologies become increasingly naturalized and normalized, it's important to really encourage critical thinking about who is training these AI systems, what data they're being trained on. I think that teaching work by, say, someone like Lillian Yvonne Bertram, who's done work training generative AI with the writing of Black authors, to sort of think about, you know, as a Black poet herself, who's worked on projects like the Travesty Generator, what does it mean to kind of think about where that data comes from and what mechanisms of inclusion and consent are present. And so I think that we still, you know, there's going to be a tendency to sort of say, oh, well, now we don't need as many writing courses because, you know, our students who struggle with academic English can just use ChatGPT. And I think all of us know that actually we have a need for more literacy education as these technologies become integrated into our daily lives.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start taking a few questions from the attendees. Earlier on, Manuel asked, how can ChatGPT enhance critical thinking? So looking at another side of critical thinking, what ways do you all think that ChatGPT can actually be used to help students think critically?
I think my demo kind of showed that. I mean, you want to evaluate the set of instructions that I just had the robot generate from a purchased prompt. If you don't know something about the genre, quite a bit about the genre and the literacy, you might look at that and say, oh, that's pretty good. But in fact, it's not good at all. Mm-hmm. So I could see having students look at some output from the robot compared to their genre knowledge, which is what we teach, one of the things we teach. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that there's not a role for that output. But I think one thing we're going to discover is that the robots aren't going to be particularly good at long form writing. And that has been the panic. Oh, students are going to put a prompt in, they're going to get a piece of long form writing, an essay or something, they're going to hand it in as their own. It's not going to be very good at long form writing if you are any good at writing assignments. It's not going to be good at that. I think it's going to be good at other things. I think Liz is right. It's going to be good with invention. It could be good with backgrounding. It could be good with various kinds of heuristic work, suggestions, other things. But it's not going to produce for a thoughtful assignment it's not going to produce a piece of long form writing that students can just hand in for a good grade and not do any work. I realize that's happening now, but understand these are teachers. This is happening with teachers who assign writing and collect writing. This is not happening with teachers who assign writing and are involved in their student writing processes from end to end. It doesn't happen there. So frankly, most of the university assigns writing and collects writing. So it's a huge problem, you know, but it's not a problem in a writing class that follows contemporary writing pedagogy.
Yeah, often so-called writing courses are actually just courses with writing rather than courses in writing, because actually getting that engagement with writing processes and practices is a very different set of engagements with your students. And and if done well, I think they're not going to necessarily respond as cynically as you know, the students who turn in material that they feel is just you know, just to get a passing grade.
I think that is a great point. It's getting back to that deeper engagement with students and kind of what Jonathan had noted earlier of creating an environment where they do want to learn and engage. I see another question. There are several flying in, but I see another question from earlier, and I'm wondering, Jonathan, you might have thoughts on this one. Raphael asks, unlike searching, I'm assuming they mean on Google, you have to sign in to use ChatGPT. What privacy issues do you think can result from this, and how do you mitigate them? Privacy and student privacy is obviously very important.
So a couple of points there. First of all, your search history isn't as private as you sometimes might think it is. So even if you don't realize you're signing in, you're usually leaving a digital trail. So being forced to sign in to use ChatGPT just might make you more aware of that. And it might not be so much a privacy issue in it itself as just an awareness issue. The second point is ChatGPT right now as a sort of its own branded specific product is a thing, but even right now, there are other ways to access these kinds of language models that may or may not require signing in, that may have the same kinds of anonymity possibilities as other tools. So it's really hard to see what will be available for students even in the very near future.
Thank you.
I think the copyright, very few people are talking about the copyright issues are in some ways the most fascinating and troubling. You not only own the copyright to your prompt, but you own the copyright to the output produced by the robot. And why wouldn't you? Otherwise, people might not feel free to use it. So what happens if students ask the robot for a similar kind of output and the robot outputs two things that are similar enough, close? Who owns it? Which student owns it? I mean, there are so many unanswered questions. This is why I want us to, as a field, to just kind of slow down, be sober, be patient, look very hard at these things, and see where it works, where it doesn't work, what it buys us, what it doesn't buy us. I'm going to have students do some prompt writing because in technical writing, because I don't think you can write a good prompt unless you really understand the product that you're looking for. And so to me, that is that could be just a great form of learning. So there are way more unanswered questions than questions, which is what makes it exciting. But I know for some people it's terrifying, but I would bracket the cheating part as its own kind of problem that we need to deal with. And I would then try to think about the other aspects that are relevant to literacy education.
Well, yeah, someone did ask earlier in the chat. I'm having trouble finding it, but I think they asked something of how is this any different from good old-fashioned cheating? And like you said, Stuart, there are definitely still many unanswered questions. And I think, Stuart, you also said earlier that things are progressing so quickly that it's, this is the time to observe and learn, and maybe not necessarily the time to try to rapid fire shoot out policies, because you'll end up playing a bit of a game of whack-a-mole, mixing metaphors there. I do see a question, who's this from Amy, that says, can you envision using this technology to impel students to originality?
Well, I think there are lots of uses of these technologies in the field of electronic literature. And, we have lots of poets, dramatists, and novelists who are using the capacities of these technologies for invention and for revision in creative ways. I think there are things that you can do with training data that encourage creativity. I think there are things you could do with prompt engineering that encourage creativity. I think there are things that you could do that involve, looking at how these systems are actually parsing language, that can encourage creativity. But I'm not a cyber utopian either. I mean, this is one thing that I wrote about in the War on Learning, is there's this tendency to have these sort of moral panics about new technologies that students use. And the sense that, we need to develop some surveilling and disciplining technologies to control these, these students are trying to cheat and get around our systems. I do think that there will be some students who will use it cynically. But I also think that there are, administrators and faculty members who use these technologies cynically, right? We've already seen public relations offices of universities using ChatGPT to produce university statements. And, we've already seen recommendation letters written by faculty using ChatGPT. So, I wouldn't necessarily just demonize the students. I would paint a more nuanced picture of these transformative effects.
Well, I think that as long as we have to, we're in a context where we have to grade an individual student or an individual work, and we continue to hold on to what I think are unrealistic understandings and outdated understandings of originality, then we're not going to get very far. Look at, if you were a student in computer programming or web design, on day one, you would go to a code library and copy out code. If you were a student in architecture, the first thing you do is go look at other people's buildings. If you're in web design, you start with a template. Question becomes, how much do I have to change the template before it's sufficiently original for it to count as my own? And yet here we are over in English context, some people looking for some new take on Shakespeare that's just not out there. and I'm not interested in any way. The way people write in the workplace with boilerplate, collaboratively, single sourcing text, so they can spin it out across many different pieces of writing. We have to learn how to do a bit more of that, but grade it, which is the tricky part. If you ever tried to grade a remix, what's challenging about that. But we've got some updating to do in our writing pedagogy, and this may help us do some of that around learning. So. Oh, and by the way, things like watermarking. If OpenAI watermarks its texts, the AI detectors, all of us have caught students who cheated with Google. We've caught them using Google. I mean, it's all of a piece. So I don't worry a whole lot about the problem with the cheating piece is that it just requires a bunch of labor.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it does. So that's the downside of all the cheating, outside of students not learning much of anything, is all the labor associated with it. But if we have thoughtful assignments, cheating's not going to be much of a problem if we attend to student writing. But, as Jonathan can tell you, so many open questions. And that's what we should be spending our time on. And in some ways, maybe what we need is some kind of a field document that prioritizes things to work on as a field. Other fields are very good at shared research questions. People do research, other people try to replicate it. Not that we can necessarily replicate in the same way, but we don't tend to have a shared research agenda. I wish we did have a shared research agenda. I think we make more progress than we often do on these things.
Yeah, I like the comment in that has come up about wordsmithing, because I think that often when you get a group of students working on a Google Doc together and kind of going through and thinking about nuance and inflection and how to pick a stronger example, and just seeing the ways that collaboration in real time is something that they can get excited about. And it's something that, as a writing instructor, they're not using ChatGPT in that situation, because you can sort of see them engaging in that collective process, like creating more opportunities like that for our students so they can really feel the joy of the broccoli that, we're encouraging them to consume, the better.
And broccoli is joyous, and so is writing. So we are out of time for today's webinar. I see many thank yous coming into the chat for you, Jonathan, Stuart, and Liz. This was truly a fantastic conversation. I feel like we could go on about 1,000 different subtopics of this one topic. I did reshare the handouts from Stuart and Liz in the chat, but we will share the handouts and slides that you saw here today, as well as some slides based on what Liz was showing us in her demo, in an email later this week. So please keep an eye on that if you're looking for those slides. Yes, thank you all. Thank you to all the attendees for taking a little bit of time out of your day. And then thank you as well to our wonderful panelists. And that concludes today's webinar.
Great, thanks for coming,
you.
guys.